So we have 4 major areas of epidemiologic investigations that we conducted during the HPAI outbreak. Field-based observational studies, sort of the bread and butter of epidemiology, some geospatial analyses, some on-farm sampling efforts, and then a whole lot of very cutting-edge work on phylogenetics done at the National Vet Services Laboratory and with our ARS colleagues and also our CDC colleagues. I am not going to cover any of the phylogenetic stuff. It's kind of out of my league, but we will talk a little bit about the 3 others. So the first is this case series that we're soon to publish on. We've actually had this paper accepted. It should come out here pretty quickly in Avian Diseases. This was a case series, which, if you remember your hierarchy of evidence, that triangle that tells you as you move up the triangle, you get more and more certain of maybe your results or the evidence that you're collecting and how that might influence your decisions or influence those results. Case series are pretty low down on that hierarchy. And then this is essentially just a collection of data. You go out and you just interview. In our case, we used a questionnaire to interview turkey flocks in the states that are listed there. It says 81 of them here, but ultimately I think we ended up with about 120 of them that were in our paper. The results really didn't change much. So we went out and we asked a bunch of questions on these 81 turkey flocks about biosecurity practices, management practices, some of their demographics, etc. And it'll be a little bit difficult, I'm sure, to see from the back, but we asked a lot of questions. And so essentially all you get when you do a case series is the proportion or the percentage of that 81 flocks that answered yes or no or a certain way to your question. And what I've tried to do in this long list of things that we asked is highlight the green ones are the good things, the yellow ones are those that might need a little attention, and then we've got a few red ones that I kind of highlight as, wow, that's something that you probably either want to stop or fix pretty quickly. And so, for example, and I won't go through all of these, so in the green category, out of those 81 flocks, 89% of them, their facilities were pretty much free of debris and trash. 73% of them had workers wearing dedicated coveralls, 100% workers wearing rubber boots or boot covers in the barns, 99% foot pans at the barn entrances. So those are a bunch of green ones, and you'll have access to this presentation so you can look in a little more detail. For yellow ones, wash spray area for vehicles, out of those 81 farms, only 46% said yes, they were doing that. Designated parking for workers and visitors, less than 50% were doing that. And then down here at the bottom in red, and maybe I should have kind of put that where you could see it a little better, is one that really caught my attention and has caught a number of folks' attention, is biosecurity audits. Out of those 81 farms, only 43% said that they were doing biosecurity audits. Now, I've been asked, well, what do you mean by a biosecurity audit? It was a very general question, not necessarily asking about third-party audits or in-company audits or whatever, but a biosecurity audit of some sort was done only on 43% of those 81. So that's one that to me, sort of stands out. We asked a lot of information about equipment, and you can see that there was and the question was, you don't share this with other farms, so only 8% shared, didn't share live haul loaders, so that means what, 92% did. Preloaders, 85% did share that, so there's a lot of equipment sharing. And for turkey production, there really has to be. That equipment's really expensive. You cannot have a dedicated preloader for every turkey flock. It's just too expensive. And so figuring out how best to clean, disinfect, make sure that that has maybe downtime, et cetera, is something that the industry is certainly taken into consideration even before the outbreak, but I think is identified as an issue for them. We asked questions about barn characteristics and also about wild birds. So in this case, the yellow one here, 79 respondents, 62% of them said their houses were bird proof, and what I pointed out often is almost the exact opposite of 62%, so 35% said, well, we saw wild birds in the house. So almost all of those that didn't have bird proofing looked like they saw wild birds in the house. And these are wild birds like sparrows and starlings and peridomestics, not waterfowl. And so we know from previous research that that's not necessarily a good thing. Second study I'll talk about is a little bit higher on that hierarchy of evidence, case control studies, somewhat controlled. Obviously we have cases, we have controls, and we compare those two. This was only on layer flocks. Most of those layers were in Iowa, a few in Nebraska. We had 28 cases and 31 controls. These surveys were administered to site managers. We sent the survey ahead and then actually sat down with most of them face-to-face and went through the surveys. And Mark, who's sitting back here with one of the companies in Iowa, can attest to that. It was a long process, but really got us really good data in our minds. We matched our controls, so our at-risk period was the 2 weeks prior to detection, and the controls were matched to an infected site and questions asked about that same 2-week risk period for the infected site. And we examined our risk factors at both the farm level and at the barn level. So these are the farm level significant variables. So we did all the univariate analysis and pulled out the significant ones in the univariate and then did the multivariate analysis. And so this was sort of that final model. And you can see that odds ratio, if you're in an existing control zone, so that 10K control zone, you're 32 times more likely to become an infected flock if you're in a control zone than if you're outside. So that makes sense. If you allow rendering trucks or garbage trucks to come near the barns, 22 and 14% more likely to be infected. Visitors changing clothes, so this was a protective factor, so if you're not doing that, you're 12.6 times more likely. And then this one I thought was kind of interesting. Company service person visited in the past 14 days. So in that 2-week risk period, if you had a service person visiting, 5 times more likely to become an infected farm if you're doing that. So those were the farm level factors. Barn level factors, barn entry with a hard surface entry pad. So again, this was a protective factor. So I always need to kind of look at it the opposite way, or at least describe it the opposite way. If you didn't have one of those, you're about 7 times more likely to become an infected farm. And that seems like a pretty easy thing to fix if you don't have a concrete entry pad, to put one out and then clean and disinfect it. Disposing of dead birds near the barn, so near in this case is within 30 yards, so these are your morts, your mortalities get disposed of. They usually put them in a big bin. If that's within 30 yards of the barn, you're about 3 times more likely. And then we did ask a lot of questions about ventilation. This was a little bit difficult to tease out. It does look like if you have ceiling or eaves inlet ventilation, that's protective. I probably wouldn't put a whole lot I wouldn't go recommending to a bunch of layer operations to go change their ventilation type based on this, but this is what the statistics came out like. So a lot of those questions that we asked in those studies were around biosecurity. You saw some biosecurity practices identified as risk factors or protective factors. This is really a difficult thing to tease out, is which of those biosecurity practices are valuable. Dr. Revriego is an epidemiologist who works for the European Commission. He and I have worked on a lot of different things together. And Paco, we were talking about this, and he says it's really frustrating how difficult it is to prove scientifically which efforts work are the most important or effective. And if you think about that, how would you set up that prospective study, right? You need to get a bunch of layer flocks in Iowa or across the country and start monitoring them through time and then wait for AI to hit. We're hopefully going to wait a really long time. And so how can we do that? And we've actually been proposing a study now that some of these layers are coming back up online to start monitoring biosecurity practices and wait for them to become infected with something other than AI, something that's a little less innocuous, like Mycoplasma gallisepticum and MG or something like that. We're talking about that. And this famous quote by Dr. Glisson from U.S. Poultry and Egg, that biosecurity is inconvenient. I know Dr. Roth likes to use that too. It's inconvenient and expensive. And both of those are definitely true. Another one of our studies was looking at wind and wind-related spread of high-path viruses. There was a lot of anecdotal evidence and speculation, particularly in Minnesota in the early stages of the 2015 outbreak, just about this time last year, that we had issues with lots of wind and spread of the virus. And so we did some real initial, very baseline work that looked like something might be going on with wind direction and wind speed, et cetera. But then we actually spent quite a bit of time over the summer using this EPA wind plume model, or AirMod modeling system, and I'll show you what that kind of looks like in a second. And also collecting some other information about wind speed and other meteorologic parameters, some temperature data, et cetera, to sort of see if there was anything there around this hypothesis about the spread by wind. So the idea behind this plume model, or this AirMod, is there's these wind plumes, and the lighter colored ones are 1% daily likelihood of transmission from an infected premise to a non-infected one, and the darker colored ones are the 5% likelihood of transmission. And then the two colors, the green are a 4 mile per hour wind speed, and the brown are 32 mile per hour wind speed. When I was up in Minnesota last spring, March, April time, actually about this time, there were very few days where it was 4 miles per hour. 32 was much more likely, and it had no one direction. It was like swirling all the time. And so this is going to kind of cycle through this, showing you these various plumes, and I'll describe this. You can see up at the top there that the dates are changing. So each of the gray dots represents a turkey flock in Minnesota, in this part of Minnesota. The red dot is when they go positive, and then these two plumes are at the two different transmission likelihoods. When you see a yellow dot pop up, that is a negative flock that went positive because it was in one of the plumes. All right. So this cycles through, and you can see, obviously lots of infection and those plumes. What we then went and did 3 different types of epidemiologic analyses, and I don't have time to really go into what those were. Just trust me that there were 3 different approaches done by actually 3 different groups at our Center for Epidemiology and Animal Health. So we were trying to keep it as unbiased as possible. There actually was bias to start with, that people were saying this is going to work. My method will work, yours isn't, and so we let them run all 3 kinds. And really the results that came out of it were not too telling, to be honest. We did, in one of the approaches, this cumulative exposure of a farm to multiple plumes over a 6 to 11 day period was the most stable predictor of increased odds of disease. So if you were an infected site and within a 6 to 11 day period, because we looked at many different periods, you were within multiple plumes, your odds of becoming infected were higher than if you weren't in those plumes. But the odds were, I think, 1.8. So if you think back to some of that other case control stuff I showed, where we had odds ratios of 32 and 22 and 14, this one was less than 2. So really not all that significant. What did come up, and is always thrown in as a factor in all 3 of these analyses, was the proximity to other infected farms had a consistent association with increased odds. So there you are again, if you're in that control zone or near another infected farm, you're going to be more likely to become infected. So our conclusions from these 3 types of analyses on this data was that given the current data, it's really difficult to rule in or out the contribution of aerosol transmission of farms up to 3.5 kilometers from a shedding farm. So I know that sounds kind of wishy-washy and non-committal, but we're really not that comfortable in saying from this analysis that wind seemed to be a real factor. But I don't want to really discount that because we actually had some on-farm sampling done of air, both within poultry barns and outside of poultry barns. This work was done by Dr. Tor Morale from the University of Minnesota and her team Monsi's done a lot of work with swine influenza viruses and air sampling. So she, an influenza A is an influenza A. We felt that it was really appropriate for her to do this work. And won't have a lot of time to go through the results here. Just leave it to say we found virus coming out of the barns, and we actually found virus up to 1,000 meters away, so a kilometer away. And so there actually is virus coming out of those barns, and it can travel some distance. These are PCR results, but we actually did get culture positive results as well. So we actually did find live virus. It wasn't just viral particle. So how am I doing on time, Renee? Doing okay? 10 minutes? Excellent. So there were some other geospatial factors that we wanted to look at other than wind or the climatic factors. And we had an excellent data set that came to us from Minnesota. They have virtually all the poultry operations in the state, the locations of them, and what type they are. And they were willing to share that with us to assist in some of these analyses. And so I don't let it go with the state partners that are in the room that if you can get that kind of data set put together, not only for poultry, but really for poultry, ahead of time, it really makes a lot of the response work easier, but it also really facilitates doing any of this kind of work. So we had this statewide data set of poultry operations in Minnesota, and then we merged that with our emergency management response records. So knowing about that helped us understand infection dates, et cetera. Included some information on production type and the location of the farm, and then looked at some potential risk factors that our friends in the poultry veterinarian friends kind of said, why don't you guys take a look at this? Why don't you guys take a look at that? And we threw in a few of our own that we were interested in. So we considered poultry density. We considered distance to nearest body of water. We were looking at density of corn within a half, 1, and 3 kilometers of an operation, and then the distance to major highways. The turkey veterinarians in Minnesota were really concerned about 3 highways, and I won't remember what they are now. I know one was 71 and I think was 12, so major east-west and north-south routes may be spreading virus. And then we did this logistic regression and boosted regression tree analysis on that data set. So here's some results from that. The species here, 10 times more likely if you were turkey versus chicken, and not surprising, particularly with this Minnesota data set because most of them were turkeys. The distance to this nearest infected neighbor, so here's that 10K circle again. If you're in the 10K circle, it's just a bad deal. So, as soon as you know that you're in a 10K circle, you need to move your turkey operation. That's the mitigation there. Hard to do. But the one that came up that I sort of my pet hypothesis from way back, and this sort of supported it, was this idea of corn. And so if you were within 3 kilometers of, or had 1,100 to 1,200 acres of corn within 3 kilometers of you, you were 5 times more likely to be infected. If you had 2,000 to 2,700 acres around within 3K, 8 times more, and greater than 2,700 acres, 12 times more likely. So the question comes up, corn, what does that have to do with anything? Well, we were looking at density or nearest bodies of water as an attractant to waterfowl, the reservoir of this virus. Corn is also an attractant to waterfowl, and which is the reservoir of this virus, and probably is more likely to harbor the virus during cold, wet winter months. The farmers go in the fields, I think you heard this from Jack this morning, farmers go in the field in the spring and start working those fields and throwing a lot of dust in the air. Viral particles attracted to the dust, they get brought into the barns and may get this started. So this really does require a little bit more work to see if there really is virus in those dust particles coming off those fields. With the last few minutes, I will talk just a little bit about the HPAI low-path AI outbreak that we had in Indiana this spring. Obviously, we did, I think, definitely learn some lessons from last year in what we need to do to crank down on this just really fast. And so the industry in Indiana took 24-hour depopulation to heart and did whatever they could to make that happen, as well as our state partners and APHIS in making that happen. But we also did attempt some epidemiological work, and of course this is these results are really limited because of our very low N here. So luckily, and I don't complain about this, although it's wonderful to have great numbers for your EPI study, in this case an N of 9 was fantastic. Only one of those was a high path flock, 8 were low path, but we just lumped them all together for our analysis. And then our control farms came from the surrounding geographic area, and we had 30 of those, so we actually had about a 3-to-1 match. Again, because we really only had 10 cases, we really couldn't do a lot statistically. But there were some differences identified between the case farms and barns. Here's that proximity to dead bird disposal and litter compost areas was again identified more frequently on the infected sites than on the non-infected sites. And this is one of those things in Hill's criteria about causation and epidemiology is repeatability. How many of these studies tell us that, you know, this idea of dead bird and rendering and having rendering trucks come on or where you're disposing of your deads. They found this in the low path outbreak in Virginia. We found it in this low path outbreak, and we found it in our high path outbreak. So this is something that really needs to be addressed. And then we had a higher percentage of case farms had visitors entering the barns. And we really can't tease that out much more than that. Kind of running out of time here, so I just wanted to get to, we did try and do some geospatial work. There were some interesting geospatial factors, at least from the 30,000-foot view. Again, with such small numbers, trying to really tease a whole lot out here is kind of difficult. But we did observe the weather patterns in the 6 weeks prior to the outbreak, and did notice that the temperature, the mean high temperature, was actually warmer during this time of the outbreak than it had been in the last 2 years. And precipitation was actually higher in 2016 than in 2015, although it was less than it was in 2014. So pairing those two things together, temperature, increase in moisture, that's what that virus particularly likes. I mean, maybe we just set up a good place for the virus to survive in the environment and ended up getting a bit of a hit. And then cropland and wetland really didn't play out. It wasn't any different really in this part of Indiana than in other parts of Indiana. And then, of course, this is a very dense production area in Indiana. And so between temperature, precipitation, and then the density of poultry in this particular area, maybe we just kind of set up again a little perfect storm opportunity for the virus to survive. Once it gets into one house and with potentially moving the virus around on vehicles or people or service personnel, maybe that's how we got the spread. But we really, with so few numbers, it's been difficult to really provide any real good statistical analyses on this. So I guess for sort of close things up, we've done in the last couple of outbreaks, as you can see, I think we've done a lot of work, and when I say we, it's a big we. Participation with the industry in providing this information has been absolutely incredible. Whatever it is you need, we'll let you have it. State partners have been fantastic. I think we have identified in some of these studies some biosecurity practices that could be addressed. I won't ever give up my opportunity to give my plug for the way biosecurity should run in my mind. This is just Brian's opinion. I won't say it's the USDA's opinion. I guess I better be careful about saying that. But to me, biosecurity and HACCP have a lot in common. You have to identify what your hazards are site by site by site, because they're not going to be the same on every site. You identify what your hazards are. You have to have an adequate way to monitor those hazards. You have to identify up front what your control bands are for each of those hazards. You have to identify up front what you're going to do to fix when they go out of control. You have to have specific procedures identified. But it's really about monitoring those practices that makes HACCP work, and it will make biosecurity work as well.